Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Great, we're going to get started in just a few minutes. I think we'll give everyone maybe a minute to trickle in, but welcome. And we also encourage you, just as you're joining, we'd love to see where you're joining from. If you want to type in the chat box right at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you can access the chat and you can just share with us where you're joining from, what island, what part of the world. Love to see who we've got here. Antigua, PEI, Jamaica, Trinidad, great. Lots from the Caribbean today. We had a session earlier this morning and we had a lot of folks from the Pacific. So it's great to get a Caribbean crowd now. Welcome, welcome everyone. Mauritius as well, great. From Yarmouth, Maine. I'm from Maine originally, welcome. It's fantastic. I'm just gonna give it one more minute. Okay, great. Well, let's get started. We've got a lot to cover today, so I don't want to hold back on the content. But yeah, thank you all for taking time out of your morning or evening. I know there's some of you from the Indian Ocean Islands here. Thanks for taking the time to join us. We're really thrilled to be here and to kick off our floating solar knowledge sharing series with this webinar. I know we've all spent a lot of time on virtual events in 2020, and some of us are probably a little bit zoomed out, as I like to call it, but I actually think this is a really great forum, especially for the islands community, because of course we're all geographically dispersed and it means greater accessibility. And I know there's going to be a lot of really good connections and conversations and learning that happens in these virtual platforms. So we're really excited. And before we dig into the technical presentations, I want to share a little bit of background about the Clinton Climate Initiative and the Clinton Foundation and how and why we are involved in the world of floating solar. So the Clinton Climate Initiative is an initiative of the Clinton Foundation. And my name is Fiona Wilson. I'm representing CCI's Islands Energy Program. We founded the Islands Energy Program back in 2012, so about 8 years ago now. And the aim of the program really is to support island states and island nations in transitioning from reliance on diesel and imported fossil fuels to transitioning to sustainable, resilient, renewable energy systems. So based on the audience here, a lot of folks joining from islands, I don't think I have to tell you that imported diesel is incredibly expensive, really volatile prices. So the economic case for renewables is really clear in islands. And there's also a climate change imperative. Really the whole world needs to be transitioning to renewable energy. And islands have been leaders and at the forefront of developing sort of the models and processes and leadership for pushing towards energy transition. So we're really proud to support islands, and we have a lot of fantastic partners in governments and utilities who we try to support in their renewable energy objectives. In our program, we provide sort of a different range or set of tools of technical support to islands. That can include everything from long-term energy planning, IRPs, we sometimes call them national energy transition strategies. We also provide capacity building resources, so trainings and workshops, like some of the courses that are going to be taking place over the next few weeks, which I'll speak more about just now. Another facet of our capacity building work is the WIRE network, the Women in Renewable Energy Network, which is both an online platform and then also a mentorship program for women who work in energy in islands, and more senior advanced stage of their career women are paired with earlier or mid-career women to support each other and strategize and share resources for progressing their careers in energy. We also provide technical support on projects. So feasibility work, de-risking, support procuring projects. And an example of that is the Seychelles Marine Floating Solar Project, where the government of Seychelles requested us to support that project, actually beginning back in 2015, when it was more at the concept stage. And we've been providing some resources to our partners in government and the utility in Seychelles to progress that project, more along the lines of de-risking and procurement. And back in 2015, that was really quite a novel idea. And it still is going to be one of the world's first in terms of utility scale marine-sided floating solar. But since then, we've gotten a lot of interest, a lot of questions, a lot of excitement from other island partners about the prospect of floating solar. Because as you can all understand, islands are land constrained. There's limited land available, and there's competing resources, competing uses for land. So it could be that land is needed for agriculture, residential purposes, for the hospitality industry. And it's not always so easy to identify and carve out a parcel of land for a ground-mounted solar project. So if islands can begin to utilize their ocean resources, as well as lakes and reservoirs, it really opens up the field in terms of the possibility for increased solar penetration. So you'll hear more about the Seychelles project as the webinar goes on, but I want to get into some of the technical presentations. And before I do that, I just want to share our website. The link is on the screen here, and I'll put it in the chat later. On the website, you'll also find details for the 2 short courses that are beginning next week. One is the technical track for those who want more of a deep dive on floating solar technology. And then the procurement track is the following week. So that track does address floating solar technology, but it's really more aimed at those who are focused on procuring and de-risking floating solar projects. So those courses are application only. We want to make sure there's a really good experience for those who participate, but don't let the application turn you away. It's a very short and manageable application. So again, I'll put the link in the chat, but check out the website. We'd love to see some of you at the courses as well. So before I hand it on over to our partner, Island Innovation, we also just want to hear from the audience. So we've got a poll that'll come up on the screen just now, just so you can get a sense of who's here today, what part of the energy sector you work in. You can choose from these options. I think most people will probably fit into one, but it's nice just to get a sense of what type of work everyone does, what your perspective might be. So we know that an IPP might have a different perspective on floating solar than a government, for example. So we'll get the results back in just a minute now. Okay, interesting. This is similar to our earlier session today. A lot of consultants, also government, utilities, developers, a few folks who are not in energy but just curious, which is awesome. This is the place to be. Great, thanks everyone. And we've got one more poll, just so you can get a sense of where everybody's joining from. Again, we really encourage you to put the specific island in the chat, but just to get a regional sense.
And just a quick reminder for everyone, when you post your message in the chat, make sure you click the blue box and send to all panelists and attendees so everyone can see you. Otherwise, me and Fiona will see it, but no one else will.
Great, yeah, I would love for everyone to be able to respond to your comments. And just on that note, going forward, you're welcome to use the chat box to its full extent, but also if you've got specific questions, there's a Q&A button down at the bottom of your Zoom screen, just to the left of the chat button. So as you listen to the presentations, if you think of questions, you can pose them there. We might answer them as we go, but at the end of today's session, we'll also have a panel discussion and Q&A. So we'll do our very best to answer your questions. Okay, great. As you can see from the poll, we have a really strong presence from the Caribbean. Thank you all for joining. Again, we had a lot of Pacific folks earlier today, so we're really excited to get to speak to you all from the Caribbean. Okay, well, that's enough from me for now. I would love to hand it over to our partner at Island Innovation. We have James Elsmore today. Welcome, James.
Hi, Fiona. Thank you so much. And we are really happy at Island Innovation to be partnering with you all and Multiconsult for this session. Island Innovation, I can see that we have a lot of people from our network in the conversation, which is fantastic. But for those of you who haven't come across Island Innovation, we're an international network. In our wider network, we have up to 30,000 island stakeholders from around the world, and we really try and embrace as diverse a group as possible, including islands from all over the world, which includes small island developing states, but also islands of larger countries like Canada, Russia, Chile, Australia, etc. And islands of all different political statuses. And I think this is a really exciting conversation for us to be supporting, because this is a really interesting potential technology for a lot of places. And it seems that some island communities and countries are moving ahead, but others are still really in the early stages and perhaps don't even know that much about the potential of floating solar. So we're happy to be able to share that with our network. I also just wanted to share briefly about the Island Innovation Ambassadors Program. So we actually, the applications end this weekend. We run the Ambassadors Program to be a network of island professionals joining from different countries. People get to benefit from being part of this really international network. We had 200 people this year, and we hope for a similar number next year as well. To interact and discuss sustainability and other issues affecting island communities. So I'll drop a link to that in the chat. Would encourage those of you interested to check out our network. And thank you all for being here. I'll join again at the end for the Q&A, but please do remember to send in your questions throughout the conversation. So thanks, back to you, Fiona.
Yeah, thanks, James. And I'm going to hand it off to Magnus Dale from Multiconsult. They have been the technical and procurement advisor for the Seychelles Marine Floating Solar Project. So they have a wealth of knowledge about floating solar globally, but also island-specific experience. So you'll get a really good opportunity to hear from them today. Over to you, Magnus.
Thank you, Fiona, and thank you, James. My name is Magnus Dale. I work for Multiconsult, and some of you might know us from before, and probably most of you won't. So I'd like to just kick off by talking a bit about the organization I'm very lucky to work for. Multiconsult is one of the leading technical consultancies in Scandinavia. We're based in Oslo, Norway. We're active in a range of different sectors, but we're especially proud of our energy practice that dates back more than 100 years. We have about 3,000 staff, and these are all based in various permanent offices across Europe, Africa, or Asia. And we're involved in different energy assignments, really in all corners of the world. So just a few more words on what we do within renewable energy. We offer really a range of different support services that are relevant to renewable energy projects across the lifetime of these, from very early phases through tendering, design, engineering, construction phases, operations and maintenance, upgrades, decommissioning, everything. And we have a very varied client base. They include utilities, developers, investors, supply chain players, banks, and governments. We We have a dedicated team covering renewable energy technologies. And in particular, I'd like to mention our solar smart grid and storage team. And these folks will be in charge of both today's technical presentation, but also much of the training that will take place in the next couple of weeks. They currently have a lot of focus on utility scale solar, storage and hybrid systems, microgrids and smart grids, and of course, solar PV, floating solar PV, which is the topic of today. At Multiconsult, we're particularly proud of a couple of recent milestones that we've helped contribute to. We are implementing the Get Fit Renewable Energy Program, both in Uganda and Zambia, for the German Development Bank, KfW. In April last year, this program awarded 120 megawatts of solar capacity. And the lowest price achieved in that tender was 3.99 US cents per kilowatt hours. And that was, to our knowledge, the lowest price achieved to date in sub-Saharan Africa. We're also, of course, very proud to contribute as advisor in the Seychelles, where a multi-megawatt floating PV plant is being developed. Several other speakers online are involved in this project as well, and I know that we'll hear more about this project later. In January this year, a notice of intended award was issued, and it was reconfirmed just a few months later. Yet, instead of discussing what Multiconsult has been doing, I'd like to share a few slides on what Multiconsult believes in, because I think that can help you understand who we are perhaps better. According to analysis that we've done, only about half a variation in price outcomes in auctions can be explained by factors such as irradiation and country risk. In fact, the way tenders are designed and implemented has a real impact on price outcomes. And just to add some perspective to that, for a 50 megawatt plant, a difference of 4 US cents per kilowatt hour would mean $30 million over the life of a 20-year PPA. And I know that Trinity, a London-based legal firm, is on and joining us today. Together with them as a strategic partner, we at Multiconsult, we're very proud to have helped several clients successfully implement several renewable IPP tenders in Africa. Now, we're all into renewables at Multiconsult, but we have specifically chosen floating solar PV as a key focus for our power and renewables division. We really believe that floating PV is indeed part of the global solution. And we believe that our expertise across various disciplines is of high value in this market. We're very excited to be joining today in the next 2 weeks, and we love all things solar. We love all things floating, and we are especially fond of island states and the particular challenges that you guys are seeing. And our starting point is that islands really have two resources in very high abundance. You have sunshine and you have water. But still, we believe that technology innovation, piloting and dissemination of lessons learned are really key to bringing floating PV to scale. And I hope that we're able to contribute to doing just that, both today during this webinar, but also the next couple of weeks. I think we'll just jump straight to the topic of today, which is the floating solar PV market. I want to give everybody just a very a general sense of the market globally. And my goal here is really threefold. I'd like to share some thoughts on where this market finds itself today. I'd like to look forward as well and discuss the potential of this technology in the future. And I also like to highlight some notable floating PV developments, including in island states such as yours. At the same time, I'm not sure it makes sense to dive straight into floating PV and before looking at solar PV in general. We know that these markets have a lot in common, and many of the drivers that define the solar PV market very much apply to the floating market. So let's try and stay general for a little bit longer. Here we look at cumulatively installed solar capacity by region and by year. And we grouped all PV installations together. We're looking at utility scale, rooftop, residential, and floating, everything. Now, before I discuss what this graph really shows us, I just want to highlight the source of these numbers. They're from IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency. There are different numbers out there, but I think it's good just to clarify this. I assume most of you are indeed familiar already with the very strong historical growth we've seen in the solar PV market. But this graph tells us a few very specific things. First of all, with the exception of 2012, annual additions of solar PV additions globally have increased every single year for the last 10 years. This year, in 2020, we could see more than 100 gigawatts of new installations, although we believe, not surprisingly, the market is probably impacted by the ongoing global pandemic. And we also see that cumulatively installed solar PV capacity has increased from about 40 gigawatts in 2010 to more than 650 gigawatts in 2020. And that's more than a 16-fold increase in just 10 years. Obviously, we'll have to wait and see what this year brings. What you're seeing here for 2020 is based on some assumptions by Multiconsult, and the blue bar refers to the end of September, so the end of Q3. So the big question is, how does floating PV fit into all of this? Well, let's compare floating PV to other types of PV installations. And let's be honest, floating PV remains niche compared to other types of solar PV installations. Of the 650 gigawatt install of solar PV, floating makes up only about 2.1 gigawatts. And that should equate to less than 0.5%. With that being said, I'm not very fond of that number. I think that very low number hides a few very important facts, because that number does not reflect the attention that floating PV is receiving in the solar industry and elsewhere. That low percentage does not really convey the strong growth the floating PV market has seen over the last few years. And it definitely, I think, does not reflect the potential of floating PV as a technology. So I'd like to share some points on each of these three points. So let's maybe kick off by looking at how floating PV has developed in recent years. In this graph, we're looking at historical builds of floating PV systems over the last 7 years. And the red bars here denote annual additions, and the blue line shows the cumulatively installed capacity globally. Key takeaways from this slide. Well, we know that solar PV is a relatively nascent market, but even more so for floating PV. It's a very young market and little more than 5 years old. But since 2015, the market has grown about 25-fold from below 100 megawatts to potentially more than 2.6 gigawatts by the end of this year. Again, the final number for 2020 remains to be confirmed. Also, annual additions of floating PV systems have been stable at around 500 megawatts or more since 2017. Now, what does this market size, what does that mean? What does that say about the supply chain, for example? Well, I think what this tells us is that the global supply chain for floating PV is increasingly expanding and increasingly maturing. And new players offering equipment and services are emerging constantly. And this really means, in turn, increased competitiveness among the players in the markets and more and better supply options for developers, investors, and other types of players looking at floating PV. So we have established a general sense of the size of the market. Let's maybe look at where things have been built to date. Now, this slide breaks down projects by size and by market. The graph is from December 2018, so it's a bit outdated, especially in a dynamic market like this, but I think the main messages still apply. What is certain is that China so far has dwarfed most other markets, accounting for about 3/4 of installed floating PV capacity. And the reason China manages to do that is really based on the fact that they've been developing some select few but very large projects. I know, for example, China has already installed floating PV projects that are sized 200 megawatts and above. But China is not the only market driving this, of course. Especially other APEC markets are also major contributors to growth of the global floating PV market. If you have a quick look at the left side here as well, that studies the size of different projects. What we know is that most floating solar PV projects developed to date are rather small in size. In fact, more than 65% of projects are sized below 2 megawatts. So how will things develop in the future? In terms of the number of markets where we either see installed floating capacity or we see floating PV being developed, we have identified more than 50 different markets worldwide. If I quickly can go region by region and highlight what we believe will be the key driving markets in the future, starting with the Asia Pacific region, it is very much likely that China will continue to play a key role, but we do expect regional growth to be driven by other markets as well, including India, Vietnam, South Korea. In South Korea, for example, they're exploring a site that can accommodate 2 gigawatts of floating PV, and I think that really shows the potential of this technology purely from a scale point of view. In Europe, development is taking place as well, and the key market here is the Netherlands, who just commissioned the largest floating PV plant outside of China this summer. In Latin America, we believe that Brazil is going to be the key market for floating PV going forward. I'll come back to floating PV in island states in a couple of slides, but before I do that, I'd like to just show one slide on the potential of floating PV. And it's always difficult to assess the potential of anything really. In renewables in general and for solar PV, numbers often tend to be different. Estimates can vary quite significantly, and assumptions tend to drive these differences. But we've based many of these graphs and slides on a report published in 2018 called Where Sun Meets Water. I believe many of you are probably familiar with it already. And this report approached the question, by limiting the scope a little bit and focusing only on the potential for floating PV on man-made freshwater reservoirs. And according to this report, and of course, based on some assumptions on the share of covered surface of these reservoirs, this report estimates a potential for floating PV to more than 4 terawatts of capacity, which is quite substantial. At the same time, we're only looking at reservoirs here. And so I think that, you know, this number should be interpreted as a rather conservative estimates, since of course there's a lot of potential outside of the reservoirs as well. Now, floating PV is receiving a lot of attention. I think the great attendance during today's webinar just testifies to that. Floating solar PV has been hailed a new pillar of solar PV alongside ground-mounted systems and rooftop systems. In terms of what is realistic to observe for build out in the next few years, we haven't done an internal market sizing and forecasting exercise. Instead, we've looked at what external third-party observers are saying. And this one example here, one forecast by Fitch Solutions, they believe that some 10 gigawatts of new floating PV could be built just in the course of the next 5 years. Now, what makes this webinar special is that we look at floating PV in the context of island states. So we've tried to create and put together an overview of what sort of floating PV developments are taking place in island states. And if your question is, what is the activity for floating PV in these areas? Well, the answer is, well, the activity level is quite, it's quite a lot going on. And so we focused on just the last couple of years and tracked some announcements on floating PV in various island states. And we tried just to systematize them a little bit. And this is by no means meant to be exhaustive. And for many of these markets, floating PV is already installed. So this is just to give everybody a taste of what is going on out there. Now, what we find is that floating PV development is taking place across at least 15 different island states. And these island states are located in all major water bodies, including the Indian Ocean, Caribbean, and the Pacific Ocean. And by looking at just 2019 and 2020 alone, we tracked 15 different announcements on various floating PV development milestones and or government declaration that just testifies to the increased interest in these sort of systems, also in island states. And I'm not going to go through each one of these announcements, but I think it's nice just to give everybody a taste of floating PV development in these areas. To mention a few, obviously we'll come back to the Seychelles project, but in Jamaica, for example, a partnership was announced for a 45 megawatt system in January this year. If we jump to the Indian Ocean, there is a lot going on in the Maldives. An RFQ for a 45 megawatt system was announced in January. And in the Pacific, using Marshall Islands as an example, some bid documents have been issued for a system sized to 0.6 megawatts, and that was just late in 2019. And I think the point I'm trying to make here is that this string of frequent announcements of floating PV systems across island state, it really highlights and underscores the potential for these systems in island states. And I think I'll leave it at that. And I know that we'll be continuing now with some more technical aspects relating to floating PV systems.
Thank you, Magnus. That was fantastic. And as you mentioned, we're going to get into some more technical details now and really drill down on the island context of floating solar as well. So I'd like to introduce Stanislas Merlet, also from Multiconsult. He's our floating solar expert, and he has a wealth of experience on floating solar around the world, but also specifically in Seychelles. So I'll hand it over to you, Stan. I think you're going to share your screen as well.
Do you see it now?
Perfect.
Yeah, thank you, Fiona. Thank you, Magnus. Hello, everyone. Thank you. I'm very thrilled to be presenting here again for the second time of the day, which is awesome. I'm gonna focus a bit more on technical inputs. I've seen many questions already in the Q&A box. I'm gonna try to answer that now. Again, it's a 15-minute technical presentation, and we would need some hours to cover everything. And that's why we have the technical track next week. So I really recommend that you check it out and send an application for that. You're gonna find all of the information on the chat or on the Clinton Climate Initiative's website. Okay, my name is Stanislas Merlet. I'm a senior solar power consultant in Multiconsult. That was very well presented before. I've been working with PV for almost 10 years now, and with floating PV for, well, 5 years. And I also am doing a PhD in parallel on the hybridization of hydropower with floating PV, which is another topic, but quite interesting too. Let's jump into the topic. What is floating PV? Many of you might wonder. As Magnus mentioned, it's still a niche, so it's not well known for everybody. Basically, you can consider that you take a land-based solar plant, and you put it on a floating structure. It is basically it, meaning that the PV modules that we use and mainly, well, the cables and the inverters and all of the equipment are coming from the mainstream industry, so it's quite easy to source. There are some specificities anyway, of course. The floaters are of course a key to the floating PV plant. I will come back with some examples because the technology might vary from one supplier to another. But the main goal is, of course, to provide buoyancy for your modules and to last for 25 years with the mechanical fatigue and the mechanical stress that you might have due to wind and to waves. The anchoring and mooring is a second very important part of a floating PV plant. You don't want your floating plant to draft and to move away. And it has to be dimensioned according to wind, to wave, to difference in water levels, to the depth of your water body, and everything. And I will also come back to that with some more inputs on how to design it properly. The PV modules are said as more or less the same. You might include more stringent requirements, especially when it comes to encapsulation. So it's more resistant to water, especially on salt water because of corrosion issues. Inverters are definitely the same. They can be built onshore or offshore, so you can actually install inverters on the floating raft or on land close to it. And then cable management is also a very important part of it. Now that the industry gather experience from floats and anchoring and mooring, which was definitely the most critical part for years, now we come finally to dig deeper in some issues like cable management. Again, the biggest difference with land-based is that the thing is moving, and that's one of the biggest advantage with PV in general is that it is static. So the fatigue is very limited, but with these floating plants, everything moves all the time. So cables might disconnect or might be damaged, and everything has to be designed properly. So in general, technology can vary. I said that. Sorry for the small picture, but that's basically what we see most now in the floating solar industry, at least the concept. It's been invented by a French company called Ciel et Terre, based north of France, and the concept is very simple. It's a plastic, high-density polyethylene plastic on which you build, you install one module. So you have one float per module, and then you connect the floats together with some floats for the maintenance access, as you can see on the picture here. But it can vary a lot. We have also technology coming from Norway, like Ocean Sun, which is pictured here. It's a concept of fish farming, this ring, on which they put a membrane, especially developed for that, and they built the modules directly on the membrane. So it is supposedly more resistant to high winds and with more heat exchange with the water, and I will come back to that. But you also have SwimSol, like that example from the Maldives, which is dedicated to offshore solutions. This one is from Switzerland, 2,000 meters high in the Alps. Well, designed to tackle wind and snow and extreme weather during winter. We have this kind of design. It's a pilot in Sri Lanka, and even this one in China. If you want to put your face on your own floating PV plant, everything is feasible. What are the main advantages of floating PV? Well, obviously, in your context of island nations, the most evident is, of course, the lack of space. So it is the use of surfaces that are not in use at all. And it makes a lot of sense in many places in the world. As Magnus showed with the market numbers, most of the buzz comes from Asia and mainly Southeast Asia and Japan, for example, where land is, of course, a source of conflict. Well, you might choose between energy, agriculture, or settlements, and of course, it is a tricky question. So using these water surfaces make a lot of sense. But it also has other benefits. One which the industry claims is the increased yield from the solar PV plant because of the cooling effect of the water. We've heard many numbers during the last year. We've heard something like up to 20%. It is probably very, very optimistic, but still, some research is going on, and we see definitely an increase. It can also help reduce evaporation for drinking water ponds or irrigation ponds, for example. The water is there when it's not salt water. The water is just behind for cleaning the modules. So that's also an advantage. And it can reduce algae growth, for example, behind. So I've also seen some comments in the question and answer box about the environmental effects. I think it can be discussed maybe later during the panel, or we'll see. But of course, yeah, well, it has an impact depending on the size and depending on the water body. So it's very site specific, but it has to be studied properly. So we really recommend an environmental and social impact assessment anyway. On the points to be careful about, anchoring and mooring is very sensitive, and it is a key component when it comes to resisting to storms and hurricanes and cyclones. We come back to that. And of course, the electrical safety and longevity of the equipment on water bodies. But well, the industry is on a standardization process now, so it's coming. Something is mentioned here which is quite interesting, the possible soiling by birds. It's definitely not a joke. The birds love these floating structures. They're away from predators, and of course they have this natural way of evacuating their food, and it can really damage the modules and increase the operation and maintenance costs. So bird repellents might be needed by laser or sun or whatever solution, but well, it can be, according to the site, it can be an issue. But well, let's speak about cost, because I've also seen a lot of questions on that. It's of course following the same curve as solar PV in general, and it is linked to the cost of equipment decreasing every year. So we've seen, well, that just some examples. It's not obviously representative of all projects, but it's just some examples from 2018 to 2020. And we see also a tendency to go downward in the cost of this. But again, that's a niche technology, and it's very dependent on the site, on the weather conditions, on the type of soil, and the bathymetry, and many studies. So it has to be taken with caution, of course. interesting enough, I mean, we see a cost here from Thailand, for example, at 0.48 USD per watt peak, which is definitely aligned with ground-mounted plants of this size. So that's interesting. But well, we can't really compare two water bodies. Yeah, so that's the evolution of the cost of PV modules since 2008. So we've all seen these very impressive curves, and floating PV is of course following the same curve on the modules, but also on the floats, which are emerging as a bigger niche than before, and then we get the economy of scales, and costs are reducing. The impact on price, as mentioned, is very site-specific. So on the lowest range of the capex, we would have big projects for the economy of scales. We would have projects with very little technical difficulties, like small waves, low salinity, typically freshwater ponds, no big wind, no variation in water level, so the anchoring is kept cheap. Anchoring available on the banks and not in the bottom, so you don't need divers and to go underwater. And also logistics. It's a lot of logistics, or at least a bit more than land-based PV because of the float. If you take the first technologies that I showed you, it's basically traveling with a lot of air because the float is full of air, but it takes space, so it's many containers, and it can be tricky. And on the highest range of the cost, then you have smaller projects with large waves, saline environment, and then prone to extreme weather events, and the high variation in water level, underwater anchoring, and complicated access to the grid. I think, well, depending on where you are, but given the plot, I have an idea of that. All of you might think, well, I'm actually more on the right than on the left, and it is fine. And that's I will come back to that. But just to give you some short examples, this one on the left, for example, is a big project. It's quite straightforward, big structures, and so on. So it's well, maybe not that complicated. The one in the middle is a bit more tricky, a bit smaller, and the one on the right is on an hydropower dam in Portugal, with a very deep reservoir and a lot of water level variations, which has a cost, an impact on the cost. So why is the island state, and what's the status? Of course, security of power supply is a big concern, and it has impacts not only on energy but also on politics and economics and many things. And that's why I want to come back to the last slide. Compare LCOE, not capex. So the project might be on the expensive side of the table, but still energy might be cheaper than whatever you have now. And we've seen this very good example with the Seychelles, for example, which has some technical challenges. I mean, it is saltwater, even if it's protected on the lagoon. It is the first of its type. Well, many challenges, and still we achieve 9.5 US cents per kilowatt hour, which is definitely competitive with diesel costs. So the investment cost doesn't say everything. And of course, it makes sense because of land scarcity. Well, at some point, this picture shows it very well. Where would you want to build renewable energy if not underwater? But there are some challenges also. The integration to the grid is one. The environmental and social concerns are a challenge too. I mean, everything has to be studied and proven. And in some extent, the limited local supply chain for equipment. So to get the equipment on the island might have an impact on the cost. But I think the biggest concern is probably the harsh weather or the storm events. And I've seen also some comments on that. The idea is that, of course, many islands are in these regions with hurricanes, cyclones, and typhoons, and all of that. And it is a challenge. And I will show you some pictures now, like this one. That's definitely something you don't want to happen for your plant, for example. Just some details on that. It's pictures coming from Japan, from a very huge typhoon last year, and thousands of people were evacuated, and houses collapsed, and everything. So it's not only a design issue, even if it's of course could have been better. But yeah, that's something you definitely want to avoid. And to avoid that, the only key is good design. A good design of the anchoring and mooring plant, proper engineering for that, and on the technology choice also. So, well, technology is not to be put in a corner. You really have to think about it and from very early phase. And then you can achieve this kind of news instead of the previous one. You can have your floating PV plant storm resistant and everything like that. So yeah, design, and for proper design, you need to have the proper data, and that's really key to understand at a very early stage if there are plans for floating PV plants in your locations. There is some data to collect in order to be able to do this proper engineering. So they are of course site related, that's the basic topography and satellite study to see the water levels. You can actually get back to images from satellites some years, and you can see the lowest ever level, for example, is my floating PV plant will just stay on the ground, or is it still going to be floating? The bathymetry is the name of the study for the topography of the bottom of the water body, and it is also very important to understand that because that's something you can't really see. Reservoir purpose, of course, you don't want anything to do with fishermen, with recreational uses and stuff like that, and then the basics, shading, soiling, and everything. But also on the weather, solar radiation, it's obvious. You need an understanding of your yield. But wind is way more important than for ground-mounted plants, for example. So it might be actual to do on-site measurements, for example, where for land-based PV, we would take a normal year based on previous measurements. Temperature of the water is also important if you want to improve this cooling effect, for example. But then the water itself, the depth and how it varies during a day, during a season, during a week, during a year. Do you have any flow in your water body? Do you have any waves? Waves are extremely important. And again, it's not waves like today. This morning, I had a tour to the site and there is no wave. It's the extreme values of wave during the economic lifetime of the plant, which is 25 years. If not, you end up like in Japan with issues with your mooring. And on the list, environmental and social concerns with the water quality, if it's water for drinking purposes or irrigation purposes or stuff like that. The environmental and social impact has to be properly studied in all of the phases of the project, meaning construction, operation, but also decommissioning, and all the impacts on the water. And I've seen some concerns about sunlight, for example, not going through the plant and impacting the life underwater. It is something to be concerned about, or it is something to study if it's relevant for the site. And there are some studies on that, and the technology can be adapted, and we have some things we can play with to make the plant less impacting the environment. So that was it for now. It is, of course, just an overview of the technical challenges and of the technology, but do not hesitate to ask any question.
Thank you, Stanislas, and thanks for all the good questions that have been coming in during his presentation. Clearly have a lot of technical interest here. So before we go to our next presentation, we would love to hear from the audience again, just to sort of gauge how much you already know about floating solar. This webinar is open to everyone, of course, so I can already tell from the participants that we have some experts who have worked on multiple FPV projects, and then I think it's really fantastic to have folks joining who are new to the topic and just kind of want to get a level of knowledge. So if you can click on which option applies to you, we'll get the results just now. Okay, quite an even spread actually, although the greatest number of responses is little knowledge, so that's really good. I think everyone's learning here. Thanks for joining, everybody. And we've got one more question for you. This is really to understand, what are your biggest concerns? Like how do you view risk in floating solar projects? Is it the wind, waves, and tidal effects, which of course are influenced by hurricanes or cyclones or typhoons? The salinity aspect, environmental impact. Is cost the biggest factor? Standardization. One of the responses pop up just now. Interesting. Okay, so environmental impact is almost tied with wind, waves, and tide, which makes sense. The environmental impact is somewhat unknown, so that's very logical. But I also think that given the Caribbean audience here and incidents of hurricanes, it's also right to be concerned about these other factors. So thank you, everybody. And with that, we're going to move on to our next speaker, Tony Imadua, who's the CEO of the Seychelles Energy Commission, which is the government agency in Seychelles that is the regulator and also tasked with promoting renewable energy in the country. And so Tony and his team at the Seychelles Energy Commission have really been the driving force behind their marine floating solar project, which is moving towards implementation now. So really looking forward to your slides, Tony, and hearing more about a specific island context. So if you want to share your screen now, you can go ahead. Perfect. Thanks, Tony.
Okay. Good evening from Seychelles. This is Tony, as Fiona introduced, the Chief Executive Officer for the Seychelles Energy Commission, who has been leading the implementation of the floating PV project in the lagoon of Providence, which is today my presentation. But before I go into the project, I'd like to give a brief intro of Seychelles. So basically, for those who doesn't know, Seychelles is a group of islands, 115 islands, which lies in the Indian Ocean, to be exact, 4 degrees south of the equator. And as previously pointed out by our previous speaker, one of the issue of floating PV is the weather, the strong wind, the cyclone. And unfortunately for Seychelles, we lie outside the cyclonic belt. We have a tropical climate of temperature 25 degrees to 31 degrees all year round. Only thing we have is 2 seasons, which is rainy and a dry season. Population of Seychelles is estimated at 98,000 inhabitants, and most of the majority of the population lives on the 3 main islands of Mahé, Praslin, and Nadig. In terms of energy, like many seas, we import majority of our energy. Primarily, we import fossil fuel oil, gas oil, and gasoline. Mostly for electricity generation and transportation. And then we have a little bit of LPG for cooking and Jet A1 for aviation. 40% of final energy consumption of Seychelles is as mentioned, is mostly for electricity generation, vertically integrated, which supply electricity to the 3 main islands of Mahé, Praslin, and Nadig, and also some satellite island near Mahé. We have 3 power stations. The 2 on the main island of Mahé uses fuel oil, and the 1 on Praslin uses gas oil. Praslin power station also supply Nadig via undersea cable. In Seychelles also we have a few auto producers, mostly large hotels. Basically these hotels are at the end of the line, and the utility cannot meet the demand, so they are allowed to have their own generation. In 2019, the installed capacity for Seychelles was slightly more than 120 megawatts, but the available capacity was close to a little bit more than 95 megawatt. As you can see, we have the main power station, which is the Victoria C, Victoria B. We used to have a Victoria A, which has been decommissioned long time, and then we have the Raleigh power station. The chart shows the evolution of the peak demand for my grid and the planet grid. As you can see, the peak demand is in 2019 is 60 megawatt, and on Prane was 9.9 megawatt. Now we go to the policy and legal framework. Basically, Seychelles has the Seychelles energy policy, which is the main policy driving the energy sectors. The policy itself was formulated as a result of the 27-28 oil crisis. So the focus of it basically is on strengthening energy security. Imported fossil fuel, diversifying our energy efficiency technologies, and also, hello? And also the promotion of green mobility. Fiona, is that okay? Can everybody hear me?
All good. Sorry, I lost you for a minute, but crystal clear now.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Okay, so then for the legal framework, the main legislation is the Seychelles Energy Act 2012. Just a mistake there. 2012, which basically replaces the Seychelles Energy Commission Act of 2009. The Energy Act opened up the general market of Seychelles, basically allowing private and individual to generate electricity, primarily from renewable energy. And it also established the electricity regulator. Just one thing to note about the Seychelles Energy Act 2012, it also reformed the electricity sector into a sort of single buyer model, where the utility will still remain as the network operator and the supplier of electricity. Main challenges for Seychelles, basically, as mentioned, is high dependency on imported fossil fuel. As an island state, we are isolated, so there's no interconnection, so everything has to be done within the island context. There is issue with regard to space for utility scale renewable energy plant. And as we have so many islands, the transportation of fuel in between the islands poses pollution risk, so there's resource spillage. And being highly dependent on imported fossil fuel, a huge amount of our income, GDP, is used to buy the fuel, the energy. And of course, Seychelles has a high potential for solar energy, which is a variable resource. And we have issues with regards to integration of the PV, the solar energy, onto the grid. As a result of not only the intermittency, but also as a result of poor neglected infrastructure, basically the network. And of course, we have limited financial and technical capacity as a small island state. However, for SAIDS, we believe that we can still play a pivotal role in the development of ARI. For example, the project that we have, the floating PV project, we can present ideal test bed for such project. We had the commission of exploring many other sort of projects, especially focused on marine renewable, because we believe that if it works on a small scale, definitely can be replicated and upscaled in other countries. As for our experience with renewable energy, it goes way back in the 80s and 90s, but at that time it was very expensive, and the low cost of the imported fossil fuel didn't make it attractive for us to really explore renewable energy. It was only after the energy policy that we started looking at renewable, and we start with a 6 megawatt wind farm. And then when we enact the Energy Act in 2012, that opened up the market. And with the formulation of the net metering policy, we saw a steady increase in solar PV installation, majority of which was rooftop reconnected PV system because of the limited land. And we did put in place certain promotional mechanism, for example, with the PV rebate and the CREP, which is a low-cost loan, which is basically guaranteed by government. So, and then with our bilateral relationship with some countries, we got some funding, and we use the fund to develop various projects. For example, the PV democratization project, which is focused on helping vulnerable households to have a small system that will contribute to the consumption of electricity. And then we have the solar school project, which is basically focused on ensuring that all schools in Seychelles get a PV system installed to contribute to the electricity consumption. And by the end of December 2019, we have around a total of 10.4 megawatt of renewable energy installed, of which 4.4 was distributed PV and 6 megawatt wind, which equates to around 8.9 gigawatt hours of energy in 2019, which represent 2.21% of our national electricity generated. Just to let you know that our target in our policy is 5% by 2020 and 15% by 2030. In the PV sector, we saw the growth mostly in the domestic sector, but in the commercial sector, which basically we saw the bigger share of the total capacity. This is mainly due to the commercial sector having the largest roof space to install PV. And we have around 7 PV supplying companies set up locally, but recent figures in 2020, we have only 3 companies that are actively operating. And to date, no IPP. The floating PV in Providence will be the first one. And that brings me to the floating PV plant project that we have in Providence. Basically, as you can see in the picture, will be located between the Providence, which is on a reclaimed island, and then Le Rocher, which is on the mainland of Mahé. So the area itself is very protected from the open waters, and it provides the ideal location for us to do the project. And basically, this project will be the first utility scale marine floating project in Africa. Hopefully, we're still on track to do that, and will be the first IPP for Seychelles. And it is implemented again by, like I said, the Seychelles Energy Commission in collaboration with the Public Utility Corporation, who will be the eventual off-taker. And we have the support of the African Legal Support Facility and Clinton Foundation. And through the African Legal Support Facility, we brought on board Trinity International and Multiconsult, who basically are serving as our legal, technical, and tender advisors on the project. The project Floating PV basically initiated in 2015. At that time, we were exploring how do we move, in addition to how do we complement our rooftop initiative. So we started looking around for land, for space to install large utility scale PV, but that was an issue. The land was limited, or if there was, we're competing with other sectors. So we started looking at floating system, and we did quite a lot of research, and we explored various sites, and realizing that the risks and the costs with regards to development of floating PV is high, we decided to select selected, which is in between the reclaimed and the main island. So we presented a paper to cabinet for approval, and it was approved. So that's when we partner up with the Interconnectivity Initiative, who's been with us for quite a while, helping Seychelles to develop its renewable energy projects. We launched the first tender to 16, but we had some issue with the process and had to retender to 18. And for the retender CCI, we brought on board ALSF, who basically help us to bring the multi-consult and Trinity team on board. So to do the retender, we had to set up a project team, a local project team, basically members of SCC, PUC, Ministry responsible for Energy and Finance, the AG's office, and the Procurement Oversight Unit. And it was a two-phase process, basically with a request for qualification and followed by a request for proposal. And for that, we had to exemption from the procurement regulation. And before we proceed, the RFQ was launched at the African Energy Forum in 2018 in Mauritius. 11 participated. And in 2019, we shortlisted bidders were announced. And in May 2019, the RFQ was launched. We issued a notice of intended award towards the end of 2019 with certain requirements to be met by that bidder. And in June 2020, the notice issued to Quadra and Quare as the best evaluated bidders. And this is a picture of the site. So as you can see, the potential plant location. And it was as is just to make sure that we provide access for boats for the resident that uses the site. And also there are other areas where we identified for the successful bidder to install, erect the PV and then float it out to the site. So the procurement process itself comprises of basically information session where the bidders, the bidders got the chance to come in, see the project, learn about it, visit the site, and even seek clarification and ask questions. Team. Here are some of the pictures that we have. So given the innovative nature and associated with the team, we conducted numerous studies with the aim of minimizing the cost and ensure we get a competitive. So we did the environmental impact assessment, the bathymetry study, geotechnical study, and all of that was inserted in the RFP. Then we liaised with the key stakeholders to create some awareness on buying and even to get initial approval so that the approval process. Lesson learned basically is important to our political will and commitment. Basically, it's important because if you reach certain barriers, it's important that the government right from the top can support you in getting over these barriers. And then the collaborative approach is very important. You need to ensure that all the stakeholders are on board, especially before launching the procurement process. And partnering with the right entities. In our case, we CCI, ALSF, and Trinity and Multi-Consult. It not only helps you with the process, but also gives comfort and confidence to the bidders. And as much as possible, you have to try and de-risk the project, being new and innovative, and establish a good procurement process. So in the end, what you want to do is have a good rate for what you are tendering for. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Tony. It's so wonderful to hear the perspective from Seychelles because, of course, you have actual experience developing and de-risking and procuring projects like this. We're going to move on to our panel session and Q&A. So I know we've seen a lot of good questions posed in the chat, the Q&A function. So feel free to keep those coming. But we also want to introduce a few more individuals here who've been supporting on the Seychelles project and again have a wealth of experience globally. A couple aspects of floating solar projects that I think are often underemphasized or maybe people don't recognize their value before they start developing are de-risking and procurement, and also the legal aspects related to these projects. So it's really great to have a few experts join from those areas as well. But I'm going to hand it back to James, who's going to moderate for us. So James, over to you.
Thank you, Fiona, and welcome to our two new panelists, we have Paul Biggs, who's the senior partner of Trinity International, and Gadi Nadumba, who is the head of the power sector at the African Legal Support Facility. So Gadi, first question for you. Institutions like the ALSF have been very involved with supporting projects and innovation. But we'll be interested for a more general comment how organizations like ALSF and in the development sector can be more impactful in encouraging innovation and specifically projects like these floating solar.
Thank you very much, James. Yes, DLSF has been looking at innovation as a way to tackle some of the main challenges on the continent. We work exclusively with African governments, including the Seychelles and Mauritius, but also the mainland. And we see a lot of potential of using innovation to tackle some of the issues, the challenges that used to be approached with a more conventional framework. And I think Stanislas has touched upon it. And when we came in the Seychelles, we were still a little bit hesitant to introduce floating solar for an energy problem where you could have some more conventional solutions. But after exploring the different technologies already available from the experts, the conclusion was that you were pretty much gathering some already available technology together to kind of create the floating solar project on seawater. So I think it's really a role of development institution to look at innovation, to find new ways to tackle these challenges. And the Seychelles project is really an easy example of that. At the same time, you have to be careful because, and it has been already some concerns voiced by developing economies, is that you don't want to use these countries as a test case. So you also have to look at where the innovation is and the maturity of the technology. So we do not want to start using untested technologies for countries that are actually really in need of increasing their capacity. So there is a fine balance there, but you also have to look at the price of electricity. And in developing economies, the price of electricity often offers opportunities that you cannot find in developed economies. So that's why I think a development organization like the DLSF have a role to play in finding the right balance.
Thank you for that, Gadi. And I now have a question for Paul on some of the legal aspects for these projects, and maybe if in addition you have any comments on de-risking, as Fiona mentioned, also. But I mean, more generally, what are the biggest legal obstacles for these projects, and how does that differ for a, I guess, conventional solar project? If there are substantial differences for the contracting, procurement processes when we're talking about on land versus a floating solar project.
Sure, thanks, James. Thankfully, not too much in terms of differences. To make sure that from an IPP perspective anyway, there is a need to be certain as to what the rights are in relation to where the project is sited. So of course, it's a little bit unusual when the site is actually then a piece of water rather than an actual piece of land. So it is always necessary to make sure that everyone understands what the rights are to that water, who actually has the ability to give rights in terms of ownership and occupation effectively of that floating site. But also you can't do it in isolation. You need to understand how you can get to that site, get off the site, but also then allow other users, and there often are other users of a piece of water, to make sure that that can continue, whether it's fishermen, other users from a tourism perspective in these island nations or otherwise. So it's ensuring all of that. But generally speaking, the nature of the documentation involved, again, in the context as Tony was mentioning, this is the first IPP in Seychelles. So the documentation as to what makes up any normal ground-mounted solar project it's pretty much the same. It's a power purchase agreement. It's usually an agreement with the host government doing certain other things in terms of political risk protection. And I think, as my colleagues from Multiconsult were mentioning, we've successfully worked with the Multiconsult team in programs which create a precedent which hopefully can be used multiple times in a given country. But it's also a set of documents which hopefully can be pretty much used in the context of the winning developer in a bid process coming in and signing on the dotted line. And that saves a huge amount of very scarce development capital and very expensive development capital, and also expensive development time as well in getting to that point. Many of us have worked on projects in Africa, which sadly take years and years, but other emerging markets as well. And creating that precedent or that bespoke framework of documents for a given project in its saving time and costs will, in the end, we believe, and it's been proven by results, save a huge amount in terms of bid tariff as well. And again, just to plug, I think there's going to be a separate procurement process in the week after next. And anyone who's interested in that can listen to the delights of me and the others bore them a little bit more at that session. James.
Thanks, Paul. That was very comprehensive, very helpful. Now, I'm not sure who this next question will go to, so I'll wait for someone to volunteer. But a couple of questions came in about the ecological impacts of floating solar, which I think would be quite interesting just to get some comments on. I remember that Stan said that birds are a fan of floating solar to a detriment perhaps of energy production. But are there any comments about the kind of the areas that these projects tend to happen and any ecological impacts for, I guess, marine life below? Who's going to jump in on that one?
I guess I
Over
can
to you,
give inputs. Just I don't have the full answer, and it's again it's very site specific. So it's quite complicated to map every kind of single environmental and social impact we might encounter in this kind of project. I think it would be interesting also to hear from Tony, because Seychelles project is actually, the impact is actually quite limited. But we discovered that by doing the impact study, of course. But in general, I mean, there is an impact, and the question is just to assess how big it is and how it can be mitigated. Multiconsult has teams, for example, that have been dealing with huge reservoir hydropower projects all over Africa, doing environmental and social impact assessments on this kind of project. And well, there's nothing to compare with floating PV. We're just talking about some anchors at the bottom, which can be also put on the banks if needed. We can also space a bit more the float. I mean, the whole design can be done according to some environmental setups and inputs. But maybe Tony, if you had just 2 sentences to add about the Seychelles project, because the impact is actually very limited.
And Tony, while the spotlight's on you, I'm going to also just ask, after you've answered that about ecological impact, if you could maybe give any input in the future of floating PV in Seychelles, if there's any further planned project.
Thank you. Yes, of course, for us, with regards to floating PV, I mean, the whole aim of doing this one was basically for us to replicate if it works. We already identified other sites for floating project. We even now are working with another company who's actually now wants to install a offshore one, basically, which is close to what the other site we are, but this one is exposed to the open environment and open seas. So we are really pushing. You know, we have a real problem with regards to land, and that's a big issue. So moving to the sea is the way forward for us. But the problem is, how do we move forward? Because there's other issues that we have to overcome, and that comes with the whole issue of the EIA, the environmental impact assessment. When we did for the 4 megawatt project initially, when we did select the site, And then we did the assessment, impact assessment. Most concern we had from residents or the public was the visual impact. You know, everyone was saying basically, you will ruin the lagoon because you will put in PV there. Just leave it as it is. But then there were some concern with regards to the impact of the environment under the sea, under the water. And for us, the land was already damaged from the reclamation that took place. So the impact would be minimal. And the way we also looked at it was it will be floating structures. So there will be minimal impact on the seabed. And basically, once the project basically live through its lifetime, it's just a question of removing the floating system, and basically you get the area back to how it was. But definitely, it, for us, the project is a learning one as well. So we're hoping to gain a lot from it, and it's a research opportunity. So Stanislas, correct me, it's something which everyone is basically researching now. We don't have a project that has lived that long to really see how it impacts the marine environment. But from the one that we looked at Maldives with the swim soul, it was more positive rather than negative. So you had new habitat underneath the floating system. So it creates a different environment. So it's very positive. So for us, we are mindful of it. So that's why we taking the project that we have in the lagoon one as one which will work, but at the same time, one that we need to research and learn more about.
Thank you. Thank you, Tony. And there have been so many excellent questions coming in, and I thank you to the panelists for the great job in answering those. So if the audience haven't seen, if you click on the Q&A tab, you'll see an option to click on answered, and you can actually scroll through some of the written answers that have come through during the course. So we'll try and cover a few more, but just in case you specifically wanted to see some of the written answers, there would be great. So one question that came in was for broader considerations, I guess, what makes a perfect site ideally? And I know that Stan covered this as part of the presentation, but this came in a few extra times. I don't know if anyone else has anything else to comment, and specifically, I guess, what are the limitations around the depth of water, and at what point is too deep, or what variables need to be taken in there?
This is the question for me then.
I guess it's to you.
Great. Well, on the last one, there is basically no limitation in depth of water. It's just a question of cost, I guess. But we see now, I mean, the industry, we have a way of defining the industry which is a bit specific, but it's again, it's a niche and it's quite new. And we have what we call FPV 1.0, which was basically on small man-made water bodies, drinking ponds, irrigation ponds, stuff like that, mainly pilots. And then the FPV 2.0 is now moving to the nearshore sites, which is a bit the case of the Seychelles. So it's not properly offshore, but it's on salt water with different constraints and different challenges. And the 3.0 will be hydropower dams, which can be very, very deep and with huge water level variation. So that's a huge challenge when it comes to anchoring and mooring, but also offshore. And we have a lot of pilots now a bit everywhere in the world. There are technology coming from Norway, from the Netherlands, from some South Korea, from many places, which are really willing to go where the offshore wind industry is now, for example, and maybe also combine it with the offshore wind, putting offshore solar plants in between wind turbines. And then, well, depth, I guess, is it's not the proper technical limit. It's probably a cost limit at some point. We're not there yet, but.
And while we're with you, Stan, as brief as you can with this answer, we discussed a lot in the first section, the vulnerabilities to natural hazards and storms and hurricanes. And you know, again, you did address this, but I think people see a lot of glass, they see things floating on the water, and they obviously they jump straight to this issue of storms. So what reassurance can you perhaps offer to people in the way that this design is done, that this is you know, viable for places that are vulnerable to hurricanes?
Proper engineering. It always comes back to that, but I have an engineering background, so it's probably also linked to that. But no, of course, and that's a bit what I mentioned this morning too on the other session. But well, solar PV became a bit mainstream now, and we build plants. Development is very short. Building time is very short. So everything is fast tracked, and everywhere, not only in Europe or in China, but also in Africa and other places in the world. With floating PV, one might want to take a step back and consider taking a bit more time on engineering, de-risking, proper studies, and make sure that everything is okay, because it's still a new technology and there are many things to check. And if we want to avoid, the industry is growing. The pictures I've showed from Japan, it's the whole industry learned from that, and there have been many projects after that to make sure that it doesn't happen again. So, well, proper studies. That's my answer.
Thanks, Stan. And I just saw two more questions come in that are hopefully fairly quick. These may be for you, they're a bit more technical, but I don't know if someone else might want to jump in on them as well. One question was if there exists a fixed structure that is kind of on water, or if floating really is the only option there, if that's something that's being considered. And the second part is about the evaporation for freshwater reservoirs, which I think is quite interesting. Again, do you know if there's kind of any data on the impact of water evaporation?
I'm gonna ask you to just repeat the first question, but on the water evaporation, there are many research projects ongoing. It is unfortunately, again, very site specific, and I mean, it needs data for a long time period too, because it differs from day to day and from season to season, and according to temperature of water, temperature of the air, and many things. And we don't have, and well, the thing also is we don't expect to cover the whole reservoir with floating PV, right? That would be huge, and that would have a huge impact on whatever is underwater. So it's also dependent on the size of your plant and the percentage of surface you cover. So it's a complex problem, but it is being investigated just now. We have data from drinking water pounds in Israel, for example. In some technology suppliers did make studies on that, and it is well, it reduces a lot. You gain a lot of water during a year. I can probably forward some studies on that. What was the first question again?
But you would say it was significant in some cases. I mean, it's not
Yes.
an insignificant amount of the evaporation. That's important.
Yes.
The first question, I think the question was getting at this idea that is solar, when it's above water, basically is floating systems the only option? Is there for example, a ground mounted structure in shallow water which goes above the water, or is it really just floating that makes sense?
It's a question of cost again, but we've seen many projects in Asia, particularly in Vietnam and in China, which are just land-based systems but elevated 1 to 2 meters above the ground. So it can tackle water level variations also on the bottom. But again, it comes back to high wind loads and is it really better? Is it really a better solution than a floating one? And with the industry growing now and getting standardized and getting approved and everything, I think floating will take over this kind of project.
All right, fantastic. Well, I think we're just gone a little bit over time. I guess one last question for Fiona, and then maybe you can wrap up. Would just be interested to know, as CCI and the role that you have, what kind of interest you're seeing on the global level. And I guess after today's webinars, we can definitely say that there is global interest. We've had most of the SIDS countries represented, but what kind of interest you're seeing globally, and the reasons that people are engaging you on this topic of floating solar?
Absolutely, we've seen a lot of interest, James. Our partners in Seychelles are really just the first, and again, we're really honored to work with the Seychelles Energy Commission and PUC there. But since 2015, when we began supporting that project, we've had a lot of people reach out to us from the Caribbean, also from the Pacific. There's a lot of excitement around the technology and a lot of questions, but I think a lot of those questions and concerns have been addressed, or at least mitigated in the past several years. So now we're seeing more projects being tendered and sort of in the concept phase. And we're definitely looking forward to working on more floating solar projects in the future. Definitely, we see a lot of concerns about risk of extreme weather events from our partners in the Caribbean. That's definitely a concern, as well as some other Indian Ocean partners where there's cyclones. And I don't want to dismiss those risks, but I think Stanislas has made some really great points about proper engineering and studies being able to address a lot of those concerns. So we think there's huge potential, and that's really why we launched this knowledge sharing series. I think that there's not a lot of educational or training resources available in this area, especially that are accessible to folks living in islands all over the world. And so that's really why we've done this webinar and why we're running the courses next week. And we're really hoping that some of the participants in this webinar will also submit some applications for the courses, because I think they're going to be really great learning resources. And you'll see some of these familiar faces on the courses as well. It's just much more of a deeper dive. Today's really just scratching the surface. So I'm going to share my screen with the link again to our website. And I really encourage you to go check out what the website has to offer in terms of details on these courses, and you can submit a very brief application. It's really quick. Don't let the application intimidate you. But most importantly, thank you to everybody who's joined today. We've had people join from all over the world, from the Pacific to the Indian Ocean Islands to the Caribbean and beyond. So we really appreciate everyone taking the time to attend and ask such fantastic questions. And of course, to the colleagues who are presenting and on the panel today, it's really fantastic insight, and we so appreciate all of your intellectual knowledge and hands-on experience. So thank you, everyone. We're going to end it there, but you'll be getting the recording afterwards as well.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you,
Great
Fiona.
session.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.